August 1944. The roads of France witnessed an unprecedented logistics operation that would fundamentally alter how modern armies understood supply chain management. After the successful breakout from Normandy, American forces advanced so rapidly across France that traditional supply methods collapsed under the strain. What followed was an improvised solution born of desperation that became one of the most successful military logistics operations in history. The Red Ball Express represented American industrial capacity at its peak, delivering supplies at a scale that German military planners considered impossible. For Wehrmacht units retreating across France in summer and autumn 1944, the sight of endless American truck convoys moving day and night represented a form of military power they had no counter for. This was not just a story of trucks and tonnage. This was proof that modern warfare had become as much about industrial production and logistics efficiency as battlefield tactics. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans alone, but in production statistics and supply chain innovations that would revolutionize military logistics for generations to come. The crisis began on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on 5 Normandy beaches. The invasion involved 156,000 troops in the first wave, supported by nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft. The massive undertaking of Operation Overlord brought not just soldiers, but an unprecedented quantity of equipment and vehicles to France. By the end of June 1944, Allied forces had unloaded 170,000 vehicles through the temporary Mulberry harbours and directly across the beaches. These makeshift piers, constructed in England and towed across the Channel, processed supplies at rates exceeding many established European ports. The Mulberries unloaded 7.5 million gallons of fuel and 500,000 tons of supplies by late June. The breakout from Normandy's bocage country proved far more difficult than planners anticipated. For 7 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces remained confined to a beachhead only 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. German defenders exploited the defensive advantages of Norman hedgerows, creating a grinding battle of attrition that threatened to replicate the static warfare of World War I. Operation Cobra, launched July 25, 1944, finally shattered German defensive lines west of Saint-Lô. Following massive carpet bombing by Allied air forces, American infantry and armoured units burst through German positions and swept into open French countryside. The subsequent advance occurred at speeds that surprised even Allied commanders. General George Patton's Third Army became operational August 1st and immediately began rapid advances that would characterize the pursuit across France. Within weeks, Patton's forces were advancing 50 to 75 miles per week, sometimes covering 80 miles in a single week during peak operations. By mid-August, elements of Third Army had reached the Seine River, over 150 miles from the Normandy beaches. This operational success created an unprecedented logistics crisis. The Allied bombing campaign that had isolated Normandy from German reinforcements before D-Day had also destroyed much of France's rail infrastructure. The French railway system lay in ruins, unable to move the supplies necessary to sustain rapidly advancing armies. Every division in combat required approximately 700 to 750 tons of supplies daily. With 28 Allied divisions advancing across France by late August, total daily requirements exceeded 20,000 tons. Patton's armoured divisions alone consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily during offensive operations. The fundamental logistics problem involved distance. Each truck carrying supplies from Normandy to forward units had to make a round trip back to the beaches for another load. As the front advanced further east, round-trip times increased dramatically. A truck delivering supplies 200 miles from Normandy required over 50 hours for a complete cycle. The same truck could make 2 deliveries per day when the front was only 50 miles distant. By August 20th, 1944, American armies were experiencing critical shortages of fuel and ammunition that threatened to halt offensive operations entirely. Forward units were literally running out of gas within sight of retreating German forces. The rapid advance that had characterized August was about to stop, not because of enemy resistance, but because supply trucks could not keep pace with the advance. In a desperate 36-hour planning session beginning August 23rd, Transportation Corps officers developed a solution that would become legendary. They would create dedicated express routes using parallel one-way highways reserved exclusively for military supply traffic, operating continuously 24 hours per day. The system would be called the Red Ball Express. The name derived from late 19th century American railroad practice. Beginning around 1892, the Santa Fe Railroad marked priority freight cars containing perishable goods with red balls, giving these trains right-of-way over all other traffic. The term Red Ball became standard American railroad terminology for express shipping. During preparations for D-Day, a logistics system in England had used the name Red Ball Express to rush supplies to southern ports for the invasion. Transportation Corps officers borrowed the name for their new operation. Colonel Loren Albert Ayres received command of organizing the operation. Known to subordinates as Little Patton for his aggressive leadership style, Ayres faced the challenge of assembling sufficient trucks and drivers to sustain operations on an unprecedented scale. He needed approximately 6,000 vehicles, 12,000 drivers working in two-man teams, mechanics to maintain the fleet, traffic control personnel, and route systems that could handle continuous traffic without creating gridlock. The trucks were readily available. General Motors had produced 562,000 CCKW trucks between 1941 and 1945, making the 2.5-ton GMC the second most numerous American military vehicle after the Jeep. These trucks, nicknamed Jimmy or Deuce and a half by soldiers, featured six-wheel drive, GMC 276-cylinder engines producing 91 horsepower, and Warner 5-speed transmissions with overdrive. They could carry 2.5 tons off-road or 5 tons on improved highways. The CCKW's standardization represented a fundamental advantage over German logistics. Every truck was identical, built to the same specifications, using the same parts. Any mechanic could service any truck, any driver could operate any vehicle. Spare parts fit every truck in the fleet. This industrial standardization, taken for granted in American manufacturing, exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. Germany had entered World War II with over 150 different truck models in military service, each requiring unique spare parts, trained mechanics, and specific maintenance procedures. This fragmentation created continuous logistics nightmares. German units often had immobilized vehicles awaiting parts that would never arrive because manufacturers had gone out of business or switched production. Finding drivers proved more challenging than securing trucks. Ayres needed 23,000 men willing to drive continuously for extended periods under demanding conditions. The Army's solution reflected the racial realities of the 1940s America. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers would be African American soldiers. The American military in 1944 remained strictly segregated. Military leadership largely believed African Americans unsuitable for combat roles, relegating most black soldiers to service and support units. Quartermaster and Transportation Corps units were disproportionately staffed by African American enlisted men, performing the unglamorous but essential work of moving supplies. These soldiers, denied combat roles not because of ability but because of skin color, would prove their capabilities under conditions as demanding as any faced by frontline troops. Most Red Ball drivers were under 24 years old. Many had never driven trucks before military service. They came from every region of America, from urban neighborhoods to rural farms, united by determination to contribute to victory despite facing discrimination at home and within the military itself. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. 67 truck companies commanding 3,558 trucks moved 4,482 tons of supplies on the first day. The initial route ran from Saint-Lô to Chartres, approximately 125 miles. Within 4 days, operations had expanded to 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles. The system created a continuous loop of traffic, unlike anything attempted in military logistics history. 2 parallel highways were commandeered between Normandy and forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks eastward toward the front. The southern route brought empty vehicles back to Normandy for reloading. All civilian traffic was prohibited. Military vehicles not part of Red Bull convoys could not use these dedicated routes. Traffic control points operated continuously at every major intersection. Military police from the 793rd Military Police Battalion recorded convoy movements, provided directions, ensured priority access, and maintained operational discipline. The 793rd's distinctive unit insignia featured 2 red balls on a diagonal yellow line against green background, commemorating their Red Bull service. Every truck displayed red balls painted on both sides and the front radiator. Additional markings indicated the truck's position in its convoy, parent unit, and cargo type. These visual identification systems allowed controllers to manage traffic flow and identify problems quickly without stopping convoys for inspection. The operational requirements were extraordinarily demanding. Official regulations called for convoys of 5 or more trucks travelling 60 feet apart at 25 miles per hour, escorted by jeeps in front and rear. Trucks were supposed to stop for 10-minute rest breaks every hour. Night driving used cat-eye blackout lights that provided minimal illumination while reducing visibility to enemy aircraft. In practice, these regulations were frequently ignored. Individual trucks often departed Cherbourg immediately after loading, rather than waiting for full convoys to form. Drivers disabled engine governors that limited top speed to 45 miles per hour, routinely exceeding 60 miles per hour on straightaways. Rest breaks were skipped when drivers felt capable of continuing. The mission's urgency overrode safety regulations as drivers pushed themselves and their vehicles to maintain supply flow. The round trip from Cherbourg to Chartres and back covered approximately 250 miles and officially required 54 hours. Drivers worked in 2-man teams, alternating between driving and sleeping in the truck cab. In theory, each driver got adequate rest. In reality, road conditions, mechanical breakdowns, and operational pressures meant drivers often went days with minimal sleep. Private James Ruckard, a 19-year-old driver from Maple Heights, Ohio, later described the experience in interviews preserved by the Veterans History Project. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. I was scared, but I did my job, hoping for the best. Being young and about 4,000 miles away from home, anybody would be scared. The physical demands were relentless. Roads damaged by combat and weather created brutal driving conditions. Hitting potholes at high speed threw drivers against cab ceilings. Tyre failures occurred constantly, requiring roadside changes under pressure to catch up with convoys. Mud became the most persistent operational challenge, turning unpaved sections into quagmires that bogged vehicles and slowed entire convoys. Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company later recalled the discrimination that persisted even during this critical operation. "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." One veteran remembered an incident where an African-American unit attempted to pass a white convoy. White drivers whiplashed their trucks into the center of the roadway to prevent black drivers from passing, creating a dangerous game of chicken on roads where speed was essential. Yet despite discrimination, exhaustion, and danger, Red Bull drivers maintained operations that kept Allied armies advancing. On August 29, 1944, the system reached peak capacity. 5,938 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. This represented more tonnage than Germany's entire logistics system in France could move through all methods combined: truck, rail and horse-drawn transport, on their best day. The scale of this achievement becomes clear through comparison. At any given moment during operations, approximately 900 trucks were on the road. 2,000 trucks moved loaded toward the front, 2,000 returned empty to Normandy, and the remainder underwent loading, unloading, refueling, or maintenance. The system processed over 6,000 vehicle movements daily while maintaining continuous operations. Sustaining the Red Ball Express itself required massive resources. 6,000 trucks consumed approximately 2 million gallons of gasoline monthly just to operate, separate from the fuel they transported. Tyre wear from continuous operations at high speeds on damaged roads exhausted approximately 50,000 tyres during the 83 days of operations. Maintenance requirements meant approximately 10% of the fleet was disabled for repairs at any given time. The logistical infrastructure supporting the logistics operation involved establishing refueling points, maintenance depots, and traffic control stations along the entire route. Repair crews had to be positioned to respond quickly to breakdowns. Spare parts had to be distributed to maintenance points. All of this meta-logistics functioned smoothly, while the primary mission of moving supplies to combat units continued without interruption. For German forces attempting to defend against the Allied advance, American logistics created insurmountable problems. Traditional German defensive doctrine assumed that attacking forces would eventually outrun their supply lines, creating vulnerable pauses during resupply that defenders could exploit through counterattacks. American logistics eliminated these opportunities. German military logistics in 1944 relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Germany had entered the war with approximately 2,750,000 horses, and Wehrmacht dependence on horses actually increased as the war progressed. Motor vehicle losses exceeded industrial replacement capacity, forcing German divisions to rely more heavily on horse-drawn wagons even as Allied forces became increasingly motorized. A typical German infantry division in France during 1944 included approximately 50 motorized vehicles and 1,500 horse-drawn wagons pulled by 4,000 to 6,000 horses. These animals required 12 pounds of oats and 15 pounds of hay daily, plus constant water access. In offensive operations, horses could move approximately 15 to 20 miles per day before requiring rest. The logistics of feeding horses consumed enormous resources that could otherwise support combat operations. German supply columns consisting of 40 horse-drawn wagons and a dozen trucks of various makes could move approximately 40 tons of supplies 20 kilometers forward on good roads. This required feeding 160 horses and maintaining trucks with no common spare parts because Germany's fragmented industrial base produced dozens of different models. By comparison, a single Red Ball convoy of 50 trucks could move 125 tons of supplies 200 kilometers in the same time period. German forces needed to move 40 tons 20 kilometers. This 10-to-1 advantage in logistics capacity gave American forces operational capabilities German commanders simply could not match. German attempts to interdict Red Ball operations achieved minimal success. Luftwaffe attacks, once feared as the primary threat to convoy operations, proved ineffective as German air power collapsed under sustained Allied fighter superiority. By September 1944, Luftwaffe sorties over France had become so rare that Red Bull convoys operated without fighter escort and suffered negligible losses to air attack. Ground interdiction attempts proved equally futile. German units that attempted to ambush supply convoys discovered that American logistics troops fought effectively when attacked. Drivers carried personal weapons and returned fire. Military police escorts engaged attackers with automatic weapons and called in rapid reaction forces that arrived with overwhelming firepower. The few successful ambushes convinced German commanders that attacking supply columns risked casualties disproportionate to any possible gain. The primary threats to Red Ball operations came from operational factors rather than enemy action. Driver exhaustion caused accidents that killed or injured personnel and destroyed vehicles. One veteran described seeing exhausted drivers fall asleep at the wheel and crash into ditches or other vehicles. Mechanical breakdowns temporarily reduced available trucks until maintenance teams completed repairs. Road damage from weather and continuous heavy traffic required ongoing repair efforts to keep routes passable. Despite these challenges, Red Ball Express delivered between 412,000 and 420,000 tons of supplies between August 25th and November 16th, 1944. Sources vary on the exact total. This represented over 1 million individual truckloads moved an average distance of 250 miles through weather, mechanical challenges, and operational demands that would have broken less resilient logistics systems. The operational scope expanded beyond the original route as Allied forces advanced. By September, multiple express routes operated across France, each with distinctive markings, but following the same operational principles established by the original Red Ball. The White Ball Express operated from Le Havre and Rouen to Paris, starting in early October. The Little Red Ball carried priority supplies from Normandy to Paris. The Green Diamond Express moved supplies from Normandy to railheads 100 miles inland. The Red Lion Express supplied British 21st Army Group in Belgium. The ABC Express route connected Antwerp to depots 90 miles inland after that crucial port opened in November. These interconnected routes created a transportation network operating independently of rail infrastructure, providing flexibility that traditional logistics could not match. When German counterattacks disrupted rail lines, truck convoys rerouted within hours. When ports became congested, supplies shifted to alternate routes seamlessly. The American logistics system demonstrated resilience through redundancy and adaptability. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations November 16, 1944. By that date, French rail lines had been sufficiently repaired to resume moving supplies. More significantly, the port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured intact on September 4th and fully opened to shipping by late November after Allied forces cleared German forces from the Scheldt estuary. Antwerp's deep-water port facilities could handle far more tonnage than the Normandy beaches and Mulberry harbours, dramatically shortening supply lines to forward units. As Red Ball operations wound down, tonnage delivered decreased accordingly. From the peak of 12,342 tons on August 29th, daily deliveries settled to approximately 5,000 tons through October, then declined to around 2,700 tons daily in early November. By mid-November, only 5 truck companies remained on Red Ball routes compared to 132 at peak operations in early September. The cost of this achievement was measured in exhausted personnel and worn-out equipment. Maintenance records indicate that Red Ball trucks required major repairs approximately every 30 days of continuous operations. The extreme operational tempo wore out mechanical components far faster than normal usage. Personnel casualties from accidents, exhaustion, and the few enemy encounters totaled several hundred, though exact figures remain unclear due to incomplete record-keeping under operational pressures. Yet this cost was minimal compared to strategic value delivered. Red Ball Express enabled Allied forces to maintain pressure on retreating German armies at the moment when sustained pursuit might have ended the war in 1944. Although fuel shortages eventually forced operational pauses in September, the sustained offensive from August through early October inflicted irreplaceable losses on German forces and brought Allied armies to Germany's frontier. Military historians continue debating whether different logistics priorities might have enabled Allied forces to breach Germany's West Wall defences in autumn 1944, potentially ending the war before winter. These counterfactual discussions often centre on fuel allocation decisions, with some arguing that concentrating resources on a single thrust, either Field Marshal Montgomery's northern route or Patton's southern advance, might have achieved the breakthrough that the broad front strategy prevented. These debates, while intellectually fascinating, sometimes overlook the fundamental achievement Red Ball represented. The system delivered sufficient supplies to support simultaneous offensives across a 400-kilometre front, while maintaining operational flexibility that allowed rapid response to changing tactical situations. No previous army in military history had sustained such operational tempo, at such distances from secure supply bases using only road transport. The racial composition of Red Ball units reflected America's segregated military, while simultaneously undermining the racist assumptions that created segregation. African American soldiers served their nation despite facing discrimination at home and within the military structure. Their performance on the Red Ball Express demonstrated capabilities that racial prejudice claimed they lacked. 3/4 of Red Ball drivers were black soldiers who had been assigned to non-combat service units, not because of ability, but because military leadership in 1944 maintained racial restrictions on combat roles. These men proved their courage, competence, and dedication under conditions as demanding as any faced by combat troops. They drove through enemy territory, operated under fire when German units attempted interdiction, and maintained operational discipline despite exhaustion that would have broken less determined individuals. General George Patton, despite his own racial prejudices, acknowledged Red Ball's essential contribution to his army's advance. He stated that the 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon. Colonel John Eisenhower, son of Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, argued that without Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. After the war, African American Red Ball drivers returned to a segregated America. Many faced continued discrimination despite their service, yet their achievement contributed to growing pressure for military integration. The performance of black soldiers in logistics roles and in the combat positions some eventually held during the Battle of the Bulge helped demonstrate the absurdity of racial segregation. President Harry Truman's 1948 executive order integrating the armed forces drew partly on evidence that racial segregation harmed military effectiveness. Red Ball drivers recognized this contradiction at the time. They were serving a nation that denied them full citizenship rights, delivering supplies to armies fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. The Double V campaign, promoted by black newspapers during the war, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, resonated with Red Ball soldiers who embodied this dual struggle. In September 1985, 41 years after operations began, surviving Red Ball drivers held a reunion in Alexandria, Virginia. Over 500 former drivers attended, bringing families to share memories of their service. Former Corporal Charles Johnson, who had served with the 783rd Military Police Battalion directing Red Ball traffic, spoke at the reunion about the significance of their contribution. The drivers had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies in 83 days, keeping armies advancing when conventional logistics wisdom said supply chains must fail. The operational lessons from Red Ball influenced American military logistics for decades. Similar dedicated supply routes appeared during the Korean War, though on smaller scale. Vietnam logistics adapted Red Ball principles to Southeast Asian conditions, with routes like Route 19 and the Ho Chi Minh Trail interdiction operations. Desert Storm planners in 1991 studied Red Ball operations when developing supply systems for the liberation of Kuwait. Modern American military doctrine emphasizes logistics flexibility, redundancy, and capacity to sustain high operational tempo through superior supply chain management. These principles trace directly to lessons learned during Red Ball Express and the broader logistics achievements that sustained Allied operations in World War II. The concept of theatre sustainment command structures, centralized logistics planning, and joint logistics operations all evolved from wartime experiences, including Red Ball. General Dwight Eisenhower included the 2.5-ton truck on his list of 6 most vital weapons that won the war in Europe, alongside the Dakota C-47 transport aircraft, the Jeep, the bazooka, the atomic bomb, and the bulldozer. This assessment from the Supreme Allied Commander, who had access to every weapons system in the Allied arsenal, underscores the strategic importance of logistics in modern warfare. The statistics of Red Ball operations remain impressive by any standard. 83 days of continuous operations delivering an average of 5,000 tons daily represents sustained logistics performance that equals or exceeds many modern military supply chains. The system moved approximately 412,000 tons total, equivalent to complete supply requirements for 30 divisions for 2 years' weeks, using only trucks and roads without rail support. The GMCC CKW trucks that formed Red Ball's backbone continued service long after the war. The United States military retained CCKWS into the 1960s. Surplus vehicles were sold or given to Allied nations worldwide, where they served into the 1990s in some cases. The basic design influenced post-war American truck development, establishing standards that persist in modern military vehicles like the M35 series that replaced the CCKW. Red Ball demonstrated that in modern mechanized warfare, logistics capacity determines operational possibility. Armies can only sustain operations at the tempo and scale their supply systems support. Combat effectiveness means nothing if ammunition runs out, fuel exhausts, or food supplies fail. The Americans understood this principle and built logistics systems capable of sustaining unlimited operational tempo. German forces failed to grasp how thoroughly American logistics would dominate the campaign. Wehrmacht logistics officers who became prisoners of war and were interrogated about German supply challenges uniformly expressed shock at American logistics capacity. They had studied American industrial production, knew American capacity exceeded German output, but assumed distances involved in transporting supplies across the Atlantic and then inland through France would create exploitable vulnerabilities. Instead, they discovered American logistics had no breaking point they could find. American forces delivered more supplies than combat units could use. Ammunition expenditure exceeded anything German forces had witnessed. Artillery batteries fired preparatory barrages consuming tonnages that would have exhausted German stocks in hours. Tank units advanced without the fuel pauses German doctrine assumed were inevitable. Infantry attacks featured supporting fires that German forces could not match because they lacked ammunition. This American capacity for sustained operations without logistics pauses fundamentally changed defensive planning for German forces. Every German defensive doctrine assumed attacking forces would eventually pause to resupply, creating counterattack opportunities. American logistics eliminated these opportunities. Red Ball convoys ensured ammunition and fuel reached forward units faster than combat operations could deplete stockpiles. The December 1944 Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's final attempt to exploit what Hitler believed was American logistics vulnerability. The Ardennes counteroffensive aimed to reach Antwerp, splitting Allied armies and capturing the port that sustained American operations. Hitler calculated that deep penetration into Allied rear areas would sever supply lines and create crises forcing negotiations. The plan failed partly because of determined American defensive stands at Bastogne, St. Vith, and Elsenborn Ridge, but ultimately because German logistics could not sustain the offensive. German panzer divisions began operations with fuel for only 150 kilometers of advance. Hitler's planning assumed captured American fuel dumps would supply advancing German units. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Red Ball Express drivers, along with other transportation units, raced through Belgium evacuating fuel dumps ahead of the German advance. Thousands of gallons of gasoline and tons of ammunition were moved beyond German reach in operations conducted under chaotic conditions as American forces struggled to contain the breakthrough. These drivers demonstrated courage and effectiveness equal to combat troops, ensuring German forces found empty dumps rather than the supplies needed to sustain their offensive. By December 19th, 5 days into the offensive, major German panzer formations reported critical fuel shortages. The 2nd SS Panzer Division halted after crossing the Orthe River, immobilized by empty fuel tanks within sight of objectives. The 1st SS Panzer Division abandoned dozens of vehicles after exhausting fuel supplies, their advance ending not through American resistance but through logistics failure. German ammunition shortages developed almost immediately. Artillery units conducting preparatory fires exhausted stocks within days. Resupply failed because German horse-drawn supply columns could not navigate icy Belgian roads at speeds necessary to keep pace with advancing units. The few motorized supply units Germany retained lacked sufficient fuel to operate effectively. In contrast, American logistics responded to the Bulge crisis with speed that stabilized defensive positions within 48 hours. Despite losing important supply dumps in the initial breakthrough, American forces re-established supply lines faster than German forces could exploit disruption. Artillery units defending key positions fired without restrictions, expending ammunition at rates that would have exhausted German stocks immediately. The Battle of the Bulge proved to be the final demonstration of the logistics differential that shaped the Western Front since Normandy. American forces could sustain unlimited material expenditure. German forces operated on starvation logistics, making sustained operations impossible. Once American logistics began flowing to defensive positions, the outcome was never truly in doubt. Red Ball Express represented one element of American military logistics that collectively delivered over 7 million tons of supplies to Europe theatre forces between June 1944 and May 1945. This tonnage sustained 85 American divisions plus supporting corps and army troops, enabled unlimited ammunition expenditure that broke German defensive lines, maintained fuel supplies for mechanized advances that outran German retreat capabilities, and provided logistical security, allowing American commanders to fight without worrying that supply failures would compromise operations. The German Wehrmacht never recovered from losses sustained during the pursuit across France. Divisions shattered in Normandy and destroyed during the retreat to Germany were never adequately rebuilt. Equipment losses exceeded industrial replacement capacity. Manpower casualties could not be replaced with soldiers of equivalent quality. Most significantly, logistics deficiencies that had hampered German operations throughout the war became insurmountable as Allied air superiority destroyed rail networks and fuel shortages immobilized remaining motor transport. Germany's horse-drawn logistics system, obsolete when the war began, proved completely inadequate for modern mechanized warfare. The approximately 3 million horses Germany employed during World War II represented a logistics nightmare consuming resources, limiting operational tempo, and creating vulnerabilities that American mechanization ruthlessly exploited. Every ton of fodder transported to feed horses was a ton unavailable for ammunition or fuel. Every unit delayed while waiting for horses to rest was a unit unable to respond to fast-moving mechanized attacks. The contrast between American trucks and German horses epitomized the fundamental industrial disparity that decided the war. American factories produced standardized vehicles in quantities that seemed impossible. German industry struggled to maintain production of diverse vehicle models, using increasingly scarce resources and forced labor that could not match free workers' productivity. When the war ended in May 1945, American forces in Europe operated the most sophisticated logistics system ever developed. This system had sustained the largest amphibious invasion in history, supported the fastest sustained advance in modern military operations, overcome setbacks during the Bulge offensive, and delivered Allied armies to the Elbe River on schedule. Red Ball Express had been one component of this system, but its symbolic importance exceeded its operational tonnage. Those trucks rolling through France in autumn 1944, marked with red balls and driven by exhausted soldiers pushing through one more run, represented everything that made Allied victory inevitable. They demonstrated American industrial capacity. They proved logistics could win wars as surely as battles. They showed that determination and organization could overcome any obstacle. The Red Ball Express was the visible symbol of American logistics dominance, rolling through France in endless columns that could be counted but not stopped. Those young drivers, many of them African-American soldiers facing discrimination while serving their nation, proved more valuable to victory than anyone anticipated. They kept armies moving when logistics should have forced pauses. They delivered ammunition enabling unlimited fire support. They hauled fuel sustaining mechanized advances. They moved supplies feeding soldiers and maintaining equipment. In doing so, they won the war as surely as infantry who stormed Omaha Beach, tankers who broke through at St. Lo, or airborne soldiers who held Bastonia. Red Ball Express demonstrated that in modern warfare, supply sergeants win battles as much as combat commanders. The logistics sustaining operations determined what was operationally possible. American truck drivers delivering thousands of tons daily through French countryside proved more decisive than elite German formations lacking fuel to reach objectives. This was the lesson that the evidence of American logistics demonstrated. This was the reality that shattered assumptions about American industrial weakness. This was the truth that Germany's leaders failed to grasp when they challenged the world's greatest industrial power. American trucks rolling through France carried not just supplies, but proof of a fundamental principle. Industrial capacity wins modern wars, and America possessed industrial capacity on a scale Germany could never match. Red Ball Express operated for 83 days. In that period, it delivered approximately 412,000 tons, wore out 50,000 tires, and exhausted thousands of young drivers who pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits because soldiers at the front needed what they carried. Those 83 days changed military logistics forever and helped end World War II in Europe by ensuring Allied armies never slowed for want of supplies. The American military never imagined before the war that it would need to create such a system. But when necessity demanded innovation, American ingenuity, industrial capacity, and the dedication of thousands of soldiers created a logistics operation that became legendary. The Red Ball Express proved that modern military power depends as much on supply chains as firepower, that victories are won in factories and on supply roads as much as on battlefields, and that the soldiers who drive trucks deserve recognition equal to those who drive tanks. History remembers the dramatic moments, the landings at Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine. But behind every advance stood the unglamorous but essential work of logistics. The Red Ball Express, operating for less than 3 months in 1944, demonstrated that American industrial might extended far beyond weapons production to include the organizational capacity to deliver those weapons where and when they were needed. That was America's true secret weapon, not just the ability to produce more than any adversary, but the capacity to deliver production to the point of need faster than enemies could respond. The Red Ball Express symbolized this advantage, rolling through France day and night, delivering victory one truckload at a time,